Realism in video games has been a pretty strange topic, probably due to its very unrealistic roots and exploration of both the very unrealistic and realistic tendencies for graphics, story, and gameplay. Today we'll be exploring both realistic and unrealistic natures in gaming, as well as the impact each has on the games we enjoy. Most early video games had very little realism. Starting out with games like Pac-Man and Pong, there was arguably no real possibility for a truly realistic game to even exist. Even after the NES, there was still almost no realism to be had from a gameplay standpoint, and most games that focused heavily on story were fantastical in nature. What real impact did that have on gaming at the time, though? Surely the gameplay had to be thought out well enough to compete with other games in its market at the time, so most developers probably never even had the idea of realism even cross their minds from a gameplay perspective. When it came to story, sure, it was possible to make a realistic one. You only need text after all. However, I think a large amount of developers of the era were more focused on creating an engaging narrative for the setting they chose, and consequently, creating a story that is inherently more fantastical. While I think there's an argument to be had over making more realistic parts of the story, such as character relationships, I don't think it holds up well over the course of the conversation for early gaming, since games at the time were so largely focused on gameplay anyway. After technology progressed enough in gaming, developers were able to construct significantly better looking, more realistic looking environments and even gameplay mechanics that can feel like a reflection of the real world to some, albeit minor, extent. Whether it's imagining what it would be like to be a race car driver, being involved in a zombie apocalypse, or even saving the world from an evil ruler in a medieval setting. Everything seems to just have that much more weight to it, and I think it's partially because of its more realistic tendencies. I think this also applies to gameplay on some level as well, but I don't think there's really any argument to be had about the still heavy focus on making the gameplay and mechanics as good as they can be. I think even the more story-heavy, atmospheric, and more realistic games still at least tried to have some good gameplay for its time, and that did seem to be a major focus even for those titles. There are specific actions developers took making their games seem more realistic, however, even from a mechanical perspective, so let's go over those a little bit and how that impacted those games. One example would be the use of inventory in the original Resident Evil. While an inventory system was not new to the gaming industry, what was new was the inclusion of an intentionally smaller sized inventory than you would expect. While there is an argument to be had that this could make the game worse from a mechanical perspective, I think most Resident Evil fans would agree that it's very necessary for the sake of balance in this survival horror game. It's not the most realistic inventory system you could imagine, of course, but it was certainly a step towards realism that impacted gameplay and atmosphere of the game. There are actually quite a few examples like this in the original Resident Evil when choosing which character you want to play. As an example, if you play as Chris, you're stronger and faster than if you choose Jill, but at the cost of having more problems by having an even lesser inventory, starting only with a knife, and needs to find keys because he has no lockpick. While the realism on some content can certainly be put into question, there's little doubt that realism had an impact on gameplay and atmosphere even as early as the PS1 era of gaming. Over the years, there have been many games that have tried very unrealistic approaches and even a few that venture to be more realistic than we've previously seen. While there are some examples of realistic looking and feeling games that end up disappointing most fans, I think the norm is that games have been getting more realistic over time with changes to its gameplay, graphics, and story, but changes that are largely different in taste, not necessarily better or worse. Using the example of survival horror, The Evil Within is a modern game that has significantly more realistic graphics and arguably more realistic mechanics overall, assuming once again that we're talking about a zombie apocalypse world, of course. One-hit kills with traps and strong weapons, even more limited ammunition, and a story that makes sense of the less realistic aspects of the game. You could of course argue whether one particular game is better than another, but I don't think that's entirely productive, since a large point in modern gaming, in my opinion at least, is that it's not meant to be competing against older games. It's simply different. There is an entirely different set of combat mechanics with only a few similarities. There's very different types of traps and puzzles, as well as a very different type of immersion than older games. If there was a time to say that the difference in engagement is primarily subjective, I think this is it. There are inherently a lot of changes that occur to games as the industry pushes for a greater level of realism, some of which can be more engaging, less engaging, or not really either. A greater level of realism or even immersion doesn't necessarily make a game more fun, but I also don't think it's something that typically detracts from the overall experience. I think it's best suited when realism can simultaneously make a game more immersive as well as better balanced mechanically. Still, that's just my opinion, so I'll leave it at that. Until next time, have fun.